Thank you very much, everyone, for coming to the first Monday Majlis of this academic term and calendar year. And it's my greatest joy to have as our guest Gabriel. And I know Gabriel for quite a long time, well over a decade. And there are two. Well, you know, those who know the Majlis, you know that I don't repeat the information which is in the invitation anyway, and which is available online. So what I'd like to tell about him too, when we first met, we became friends immediately, and then he helped me. I owe him actually my second article in English, and it was due to his generosity to read my paper, and he gave me lots of valuable feedback. And perhaps the most important was that, Istvan, there are at least two papers here, so make it two articles. So, and this may have been important in my careers at the beginning, having not one but two papers published. So this is the sort of advice what you get from your slightly, well, Gabriel was just some step ahead of me, but he was instrumental, and that's one of the reasons why we have this Majlis, is also about the advice of scholars, because these things help a lot. The other one was even before that, I think, when I saw him giving a lecture. It was in a Mesa conference, and after the lecture, which was brilliant, there was some heated debate on the topic. I guess Gabriel was already used to this, and he is much more used, even more used to this now, given his research. Anyway, I really liked the way how he replied to the to all criticism with firmness but respect. And then he concluded the discussion with something like the following sentence: well, we disagree on this point, but I have a wife, and I think at that time he had four children, so I know I'm never right. And yeah, well, I have three daughters and a wife, and I definitely know I'm never right. They help us to know this, but I think that's actually something very deep, and this is my agnostic approach to everything, including academia. That as long as we know we are never right, that's a good way to start research and discussion, and then we can agree with our opponents on, well, I don't know, you don't know. We make our jihad to get to some approximative truth as much as we can. So yes, these are early lessons I learned from you, and this might be funny for you because you probably don't remember either of these things, but it's also interesting how one can influence someone else's life without realizing it the slightest way. And luckily, I'm sure you influence many people's life, and like you did in my case, in the very good way. So thank you for this, Gabriel. And I will give Gabriel, I spoke enough, but many of you who are not familiar with the Majlis structure, though many of you are, as far as I can see, the people here. Those who are not, our speakers have the first part of the Majlis is about their own life, their own venture, own journey in life, and then in academia, and the experiences and advice they want to share, which is not necessarily something that we get to do in more formal uh, format, and then we go ahead with the lecture as planned. Gabriel, please
Thank you.
enlighten us.
I can't promise that. I definitely cannot promise that, Esteban. But thank you. Great to see you again. I wish I were in Exeter, but this is better than nothing. So thanks for this opportunity. Kumail, very happy to connect with you in this way. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks to everyone for being here as well. So I'll speak for maybe 15 to 20 minutes about my personal and academic journey. And I don't know if you want to follow up before I get into the formal lecture. Maybe the beginning part or the best point of departure for telling my story is my middle name. Saeed. So that was the name of my grandfather, my maternal grandfather. I grew up in a suburb in the northeast of the United States, in the state of Connecticut, and didn't speak any Arabic at all. But I had on my mother's side roots from Damascus, Syria. Actually, the family's history is a little more complicated than that, but let's just say Damascus, Syria. And the middle name that was given to me after my grandfather just kind of, it's with you. You bear it with you through your life. And I always felt like, you know, curious about the history of the family, and that curiosity, the flames of that curiosity, continue to burn because folks would often ask, like, "Wait, Gabriel Reynolds sounds very, kind of bland, boring. But what is this, Saeed? Is it said or Saeed? Where does that come from?" So when I was an undergraduate student at Columbia University, I went to the Middle East for the first time. I decided to major in Middle Eastern studies because of the family background. I began studying Arabic. I didn't know much Arabic at all going into undergraduate studies, and I began taking, modern standard Arabic classes. And I think it was the first summer, it might have been the second, I went to Jordan for a summer language study program to a small city in the north. And one weekend, I took a taxi with some friends to Damascus and connected with the distant family there of my mother. And then I went back summer after summer to the village of the family there. So I began to learn a little bit of Syrian Arabic in addition to carrying on with modern standard Arabic. I thought initially I'd do something modern, but things, I mean, without going into all the details, the way my studies turned out, I wasn't super happy with the courses on modern Islam that I had. And I became more and more interested in religion. And a lot of that was kind of just living in a village in the summers in Syria. I was in kind of the Christian corner there. So my mother's family going back are Antiochian Orthodox. In Arabic, people say Rum Orthodox. So I was in that corner, but in a village called Dareya. It's a suburb of Damascus, which is overwhelmingly Sunni Muslim. And so, conversation after conversation of people inviting me to Islam, inviting me to Islam. Why aren't you Muslim? So inevitably, I eventually became very interested in religion. When I showed up for my graduate studies at Yale University, my initial sort of project was a direct result of those "Why aren't you a Muslim?" conversations. So I thought I would study kind of the history of Muslims arguing for Islam and against Christianity. So I had heard a lot of those arguments. In those days, there were lots of arguments that were from Ahmed Didat, who of course was South African and mostly did his teaching and preaching in English, but everything had been dubbed into Arabic. I mean, everyone knew about Ahmed Didat. So, some of Didat's arguments are very sort of based on sort of his own engagement with Christian apologetics, but some of them were very classical things that you can find with Jahiz and early Muslim thinkers. So yeah, that's was sort of my mindset. I went to Yale University. I was a student of a German scholar named Gerhard Böwring. He trained many students in Islamic studies. Some really famous scholars today, like Yasser Qadi, Walid Saleh, Suleiman Murad, and many, many others, Hussein Abdussatir, et cetera, et cetera. This goes on and on. So, sort of all disciples of GB, Gerhard Böwring. I entered Yale, I think in the fall of 97. And so 3 or 4 years in Christoph Luxemburg's, the original a German version of his book came out, the Syro-Aramaic reading of the Quran. And, it just caused a storm in the world of Quranic studies. Uh, Professor Bervering was quite interested in it. We had lots of conversations. I went to a conference in Beirut, somewhere around there, and that was really like the hot topic. It must have been 2001. So meanwhile, I was working on a dissertation on a Mu'tazili fellow named ʿAbd al-Jabbār and what he said about Christianity. But I remember that conference was a bit of a turning point. There were some scholars who were students of Angelika Neuwirth from Berlin who were there, including one, Nikolai Sinai, who's now very famous, and down the road at Oxford. And everyone was fighting about Luxembourg. Does the Quran really have this sort of what Luxembourg called a Mischsprache, this mixed language, Syriac, Arabic? Is it okay to start removing dots and vowels from Quranic passages to get a better reading? There was already lots of talk about the famous argument Luxembourg had about the Hur Ain, that Hur meaning white, and Ain, although generally translated as eyes, is actually a reference to pearls. And so white pearls was a sort of poetic way of referring to the grapes of paradise and not to the maidens of paradise. So people are sort of going crazy about this argument. I think there was an article in the front page of the New York Times. I think it was a front page, not like the front page of a religion supplement, but the actual front page. Of course, this was turbocharged by September 11, 2001, and the panic about Islamic martyrs and this idea that martyrdom is fueled by a desire for the maidens of paradise. I mean, I never actually looked into it too much, but I suspect that the reason for that sort of attention for a pretty obscure German book by an obscure German publisher, by an author who wrote under a pseudonym, was related to the panic around 9/11 and a sort of fantasy that, oh, maybe if the Quran is actually not referring to maidens of paradise, but just to grapes, then this will sort of solve the problem. So yeah, I mean, it was because of Christoph Luxemburg that I sort of became aware of the whole field of Quranic studies. So even as I was wrapping up a dissertation which was on this medieval Muslim Mu'tazili figure, ʿAbd al-Jabbār, who wrote a book called, excuse me, Tathbit Dalail al-Nubuwah, in which so the confirmation of the proofs of prophecy, in which he engages in about 120 pages with the claims of Christians. So that was the actual dissertation. But in the midst of that, as I was wrapping that up, I suddenly became fascinated by the field of Quranic studies, and not only Luxembourg, but kind of began at the beginning and read a lot of kind of classical, so-called Orientalist scholarship, beginning with Notre and others, to try to sort out the whole backdrop to the debate around the Luxembourg book. And I was able to still get in classes on Syriac. That was also thanks to Luxembourg. I'd never planned to study Syriac, so I began classes on Syriac as well. And then I was a year in Lebanon and Syria during my graduate studies, and I was able to study Syriac in Beirut as well. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, Istvan, how much further I should go with the personal story before I let you follow up a bit, but just to sort of connect the dots between graduate studies and the University of Notre Dame. So I was hired in the Department of Theology at Notre Dame, which was a pretty strange experience for me because although I am a Catholic, I never studied in a Catholic school. Like even my primary school was just a public school, and college, graduate school was never studied theology at all. And So I ended up there and was surrounded by folks who spoke about the same topics, but with a different sort of language. So with a theological language, asking questions about God and God's nature and God's relationship to humanity. But in fact, I just like to sort of note that part of my story is just a mentorship I had especially from folks at Notre Dame. John Cavadini was the chair back then, but I've also had great colleagues who work in Islamic studies at Notre Dame through the years. Ibrahim Musa, Mahan Mirza, Munim Suri in a special way, who's in the theology department as well with me at Notre Dame. And then I had the special ability, thanks to the support of Notre Dame, to host a few conferences. So maybe I'll sort of just mention how those conferences went a bit and some of the folks that I met there, which might be interesting, because that had a big impact. So I was kind of like scrambling in Quranic studies, trying to understand like why did Nudaka become sort of the founding father of the whole field? What does it mean to speak of a history of the Quran? His original book was Geshishta des Qur'ans. What does that mean? A history of the Quran? What does he mean by that? Why did he have a fight with this other German, Karl Fohlers, about the nature of the Arabic of the Quran? And then obviously, especially with the works of John Burton and John Wansbrough in the late 1970s, why did they differ so profoundly with Nodika? So as I was scrambling to sort of sort all these things out, I was able to organize these conferences. And in the first big conference we had at Notre Dame, which led to the first collected book called the Qur'an in its historical context. There were a number of people there that would go on to be sort of mentor-like figures to me, including Andrew Rippin, who was at that conference, Samir Khalil Samir, who's an Egyptian Jesuit, and colleagues that I would stay in touch with for years. And then the second big conference, in the second conference, we wanted to include folks who were sort of Muslim intellectuals who had a foot in both worlds, sort of, in the believing community and then in the academic world. So Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid will be familiar to many, was able to come all the way to remote South Bend, Indiana. I think he was in Holland already at that point, so he wasn't traveling from Egypt. All of the story of his apostasy trial had already taken place. But also Abdul Karim Saroush, who was also outside of Iran. I think he was in the UK at the time, came there. And so we were able to host both of them. And that was sort of another chapter of my life as well, becoming more interested, engaged in Muslim intellectual life around the Quran and theologically as well. So I continue to be very interested in both sort of the historical critical study of the Quran and in theological questions, personally as a Catholic, so Catholic theology, and as sort of an onlooker and conversation partner with Muslim sort of theological conversations. It may be a surprise to folks that in my teaching at Notre Dame, I'm really interested in sort of Muslim influencers these days in English principally. So, my students see a lot of content from mostly Muslim Americans like Yasser Qadhi, who I mentioned, also Omar Suleiman, Hamza Yusuf, and others. I'm very interested in kind of observing how Muslims are engaging, especially with all the stuff that's going on in the West, as a way, among other things, of helping Catholics and other non-Muslims think through their own sort of place in the same context. Istvan, maybe I'll stop there, and if you have follow-up questions, I can comment more.
Sure. Thank you, Gabriel. Yes, I do. And I don't know which way to go. First of all, which are there such experiences and advice you have in mind about anything? And then I can ask also specifically you want to share with junior or not that junior colleagues from anything from how to do research and manage your time to engagement with audiences. You have your own online presence, and also on anything, even grant writing or anything you want to share. for
Yes.
career or for life.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
for instance, Shaukat Torawa's advice was one which I really enjoyed, who said that if you measure, if you, talking as the present head of department at Yale, that if you measure uh, your life success in academic progression, then you are on a very bad trajectory. And it was nice to hear it from him. But yes, so Gabriel.
Absolutely. I mean, my probably my I don't know if they're my two favorite novels, but among my very favorite novels are the big books by Leo Tolstoy. And so there's a character in both War and Peace and Anna Karenina. So in War and Peace, it's Pierre Bezukhov, and it's Levin, I think, in Anna Karenina, who both, in some ways, are at sort of the height of society. Especially Pierre Bezukhov, after the Tsar, is sort of the richest man in Russia. And Tolstoy tells her story in both cases. It's probably autobiographical, in which they see sort of the emptiness of all of their power and prestige and accomplishments. And it's the simple life without fame that in which they find well-being. She Tolstoy's own example is kind of interesting for that as well. So yeah, I mean, I think Showkat to me sort of articulates something in those two novels. I would say for well-being as well, in my case, finding friendships are really important in academia, which can be a brutal vocation, because on the one hand, you tend to be alone, and we spend too much time in front of our laptops, or secluded in a library or secluded in our house. But on the other hand, there's obviously lots of polemics, sometimes straw man arguments, caricatures, assumptions, personal attacks. That kind of stuff goes down a lot in academia, not just in religious studies or Islamic studies. I think it's sort of um, par for the course, we would say, in an American idiom, is very common in all fields of academia. So, so it's tough, it's brutal, and friendships, I think, are really important to cultivate friendships. I mean, any friends, like the person down the street or in your building, but in a special way with other colleagues in the field that, you can support each other. That's probably my biggest takeaway, Istvan.
Hmm. This reminded me of Napoleon Chagnon, in, who wrote a book titled something like Between Two Dangerous Tribes. Yeah, the Yanomeno. I don't know how. I'm sorry, I don't know I never pronounced the name of the tribe, which about whom he wrote, and I think it was sociologists, the other, or anthropologists.
Mm,
So the
yes,
academics
yes.
who the other dangerous tribe. Um, yes. Now, okay, on seclusion, how do you manage to get into seclusion and occultation for writing and doing all what you do while you have 5 children? I mean, this is a very real question.
Yes. So, yeah, I mean, in terms of production, to me, actually, yeah, it is important to emphasize, um, it's not enough just to lament that there's a publish or perish culture. With my students and with younger junior colleagues, it's really important to like take that serious because it is a publish or perish culture. There might be certain institutions in which you get a job and it's teaching focused, and so then you're sort of safe. But otherwise, it's not just the number of publications, it's the right publisher, it's the right journal. So, I mean, eyes wide open when you get into this game. It's like you get into a boxing match, should know what the rules of boxing are, and not play it nice, like, use everything you can to beat your opponent. Maybe that's not the right analogy. But yeah, so I think it is important to take practical steps. I mean, maybe I'll just mention one thing so I don't go on and on, Istvan. But we have for our PhD students writing dissertations, um, I don't know that name, something like small groups, but there's a better name in which they're basically accountability for writing, and they meet often, I don't know, once every week or once every other week, and they give a report of what they've accomplished over the past week or 2 weeks and what they will accomplish in the coming period. So yeah, I think that's really, really important. You don't actually have to meet in person with a group as our students do it. But if you have accountability where you're checking in with ideally an academic colleague, and so maybe one last. I said I was going to say one thing. I have one more thing. For me, I sort of had aspiration of one referee journal article per year. Um, and very often, at least in the American job market, it's expected, even if you've just finished your PhD, that you'll have at least one referee journal article when you come out on the job market. And for me, that was sort of a pace I tried to set. In the American job market, referee journal articles are valued more highly. So that's maybe one other thing.
Mm. Thank you. This is very useful. And I one other question is on, given the sensitivity
Mhm.
of the topic, it's both it both um, very appealing. It is interesting for many people. On the other hand, it is also very heated. It touches the personal fate and communal fate
Yes,
of billions of people.
yes.
How to navigate this with personal honesty and religious honesty and academic honesty, and yes, and also how to avoid and hatred and how to deal with hatred when you are facing it.
So I don't have a great answer to that one. I don't think there's a solution. I mean, I don't think there's an answer, a pill or antidote that would allow, uh, you know, it's like if you're going out camping and you need some drinking water, you can get water from a stream or a lake and you put a tablet in, which makes it potable. Like there's no tablet like that makes the water of academia potable. There's always going to be that murkiness or that difficulty. So, yeah, I mean, first, I would say that people often overestimate the sort of they imagine that I get more sort of hatred than I do. And I think that's a bit of a caricature of Muslim discourse. This idea that it's like it's right to well, in my case, it wouldn't be takfir, but it's right to you immediately call somebody a kafir, like right away, says one sentence, like this is a caricature of Muslim intellectual discourse, within internal Islamic discourse, with all the different positions, there's the standard, like the norm is respectful back and forth among Muslims, even with differences. And so too, that's been the norm in yeah, it is complicated because, sometimes I'm speaking as an academic things, but, maybe the public receiving it is more in a confessional or believing mode. So it can get complicated. But even then, the norm is respect, and if someone say helm or adab to use Arabic expressions, that's the norm. So I just add that as well, that uh, it is really inaccurate to imagine that Muslims don't have thick skins, and so you can't even talk about Muhammad or something like that.
And you don't get it either from the Christian side. You don't get because, well, we know Christians who can, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, most of my work, as you know, Istefan, is on Islamic studies. But I do have Christians who would say, "Oh, you were just I think you've had John Esposito on a Monday Majlis.
Yeah.
No, you're acting just like Esposito, like you're just caving, you're just giving in. So there is, I've had that kind of feedback, definitely.
Mm. Well, okay, we could go on this, and we will probably do at some point, but it's time now for. Unfortunately, Gabriel won't have much time for overtime, so it's better to start with the with the lecture.
Okay, are you ready for me to share, Istvan?
Yes, please.
Okay, so do this and this. Okay, look okay?
Perfect, perfect.
Okay, great, terrific. Okay, so let me just go back to the opening slide. So, the title is about two animals in the Quran. There are actually lots of animals in the Quran, generally positive characters in the Quran. There's a book by Sara Talili of the University of Florida on animals in the Quran. She has a more kind of theological take where she's reflecting on whether there's sort of human exceptionalism in the Quranic view of the cosmos. Are humans sort of in a special place vis-a-vis creation? So I'm not going that deep. I'm just using kind of two stories about animals in the Quran, one about a dog and one about a bird, to make a larger point connected to my recent book on Christianity in the Quran. So that's the background to the talk. I'll try to, I think maybe 25 minutes. That will be my goal, if that's okay, Esteban. So I find it helpful to clarify what I'm not arguing. So in the book and in this lecture, I'm not arguing that the Quran is a Christian text. That might seem strange. Who would argue that? Actually, there is a long tradition beginning in the medieval period, but continuing in 2025, 2026, where folks say, oh, Muslims didn't understand the Quran. It actually has this hidden Christian meaning if only you see ABC, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not arguing that. The second point is connected, but necessarily then I'm not arguing that Muslim scholars got the Quran's message all wrong. Actually, I'm interested not in the meaning of the Quran or presenting a new sort of exegesis of the Quran as much as I'm interested in thinking about the world of the Quran. And then that third point is connected. I do have arguments that break with tradition about the world of the Quran, but my argument is not that Islam actually began in Palestine or Syria or Jordan or somewhere, as opposed to Mecca and Medina. I believe Islam began more or less where the tradition says it did, and more or less when the tradition said it did. So, what am I arguing? You have the statement there that Christianity, even though in some sense it's nowhere in the Quran, in another sense it's everywhere in the Quran. So, to advance this argument, I was just three steps here. So, I'll give some background about traditional ideas and why I think they are wrong. And then we'll talk about the two stories in the Quran that involve two animals. So let's start with some traditional ideas. There's a quotation there on the bottom from a guy named, I forget his first name, but it starts with an R, Spear. He was actually an American. He was a Protestant missionary, and this is from the Acts of a Protestant missionary conference held in India in 1911. And I use this quotation because it sort of sets up what I want to argue in this first part of the talk. Namely, the standard idea is there were no real Christians in Muhammad's Arabia. Okay, so I'm not going to read all of the quotations. Hopefully, I'll leave the slide up long enough that you can read most of it. But where do folks like Spear or other Westerners, whether they're missionaries or academics or both or whatever, get this idea that there were no real Christians around? Well, it's principally from the way they read the early Islamic biographies of Muhammad, where you have these stories of Christians either on the margins of the Hijaz or who show up in the Hijaz and then disappear from the scene. There are many examples of this. One could speak about the first Hijrah, so-called first Hijrah to Ethiopia. But I've given this one example, which is from Muhammad's childhood, where on a journey with his uncle Abu Talib to Syria, they meet famously this monk who's in a cave, Bahira, and he has this book or books. What book is this? It's not really said. He finds signs in this book which match with the signs that he's seen, including the so-called khatam, the birthmark between the shoulder blades of the Prophet Muhammad, which confirms that he is a prophet. Now, so scholars like Spear were influenced by this, but also academic scholars like Richard Bell, the Scottish scholar, famous. I mean, in some ways, for Anglophone scholarship, although there are some folks writing in English before Bell in an academic mode, there aren't that many. And nevertheless, Bell sort of establishes kind of that basic take about Islam's emergence. A lot of this is found in his translation, in his introduction to the Qur'an, but also in this book, The Origin of Islam in its Christian Environment. And the basic argument is more or less what I said. Christians are either on the margins or they're just showing up. It's almost cringe. My kids would say it's cringe when he says camel riders and caravans, so very much that kind of vibe of no serious Christian communities, just individuals. And this has serious implications for the way that Bell understands Muhammad's own personality, his intellectual formation, and consequently, because Bell sees Muhammad as the author of the Qur'an, for how he sees the Qur'an. So for Richard Bell, Muhammad just didn't have access to serious, reliable information about Christianity because there were no significant Christian communities around him. Now, this is for people like Bell and his disciple Montgomery Watt, coupled with a second idea, which is also, in my opinion, taken from the early Islamic biographies of Muhammad, namely that independently from the presence of Christians on the margins of the Hijaz, the pagan Arabs of the Hijaz were sort of inevitably drifting towards monotheism. So Gerald Halting, in his book, The Idea of Idolatry, has a really excellent discussion of this, which he calls an evolutionary path. And this idea of sort of the drifting of people necessarily from primitive polytheism to sophisticated monotheism is something that's not only with scholars in the humanities, but also it's now seen as outdated, but earlier was very common in the social sciences as well. So sociologists, anthropologists had this general idea that primitive societies are polytheistic and polytheistic societies are primitive. And, naturally humans, as there's natural selection on the sort of DNA genetic level, there's also a sort of natural selection that is more social, but even religious, which leads people towards monotheism. And this process was taking place in Arabia, which is why when the Qur'an says, for example, if you ask them, them being the mushrikun, who created the heavens and the earth, they will say Allah. So they were kind of there. You also have these reports of Hanifs, which we could speak about later. The more of the same kind of stuff, but these quotations here on this page, so there's Spear again, and then another, Hamilton Gibb, although he ended up at Harvard, I think was British as well. There's another idea which comes here that all of these Western figures that I've mentioned so far have all been British, English or Scottish, and have all been Protestants. So there is something also Protestant in the take that these gentlemen have about early Islam, namely that the church itself had become decadent, and it really wouldn't be till Luther in 1517 that it would recover its sort of pure apostolic character. So this means for someone like Hamilton Gibb, also for Spear, even the sort of mainstream Christian communities of the East, so Melkites, Jacobites, and the Church of the East, I mean, even those churches were decadent. And sometimes, I mean, you see it in the Spear quote a little bit. If Muhammad had just met a real sort of good, I don't know, Scottish Presbyterian, something like that, he would have become a Christian. But, poor guy, he only met these decadent, Eastern Christians. This idea is not just something you find among Brits in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, whatever. It's still very common in scholarship. So I don't mean in any way to throw shade at Professor Lazme, because this book is one of the great achievements in the field of early Islam in the past few decades. Incredible, incredible work, and I agree with a lot of it, but I don't agree with his argument that essentially the Hejaz remained this sort of pagan island, which was sort of behind the times from the rest of the late antique Middle East. So you can see that quotation there. Now, I do agree with his argument that the way he puts it, I should just read what he says. So the Quranic biblicism did not amount to a biblicization of the Qur'an, but rather involved the Qur'anization of biblical figures. In other words, that the Qur'an does not just repeat biblical stories, but transforms them. And we'll see that in this lecture. But the biggest takeaway from the slide is just to say that this view is still around, that, the Hejaz fundamentally was untouched by sort of the deeply rooted churches of the Middle East. I'm going to go pretty quickly through these next few slides, but they're just some sort of evidence against the idea of Mecca as a pagan reservation. So I just want to give a hat tip here to David Bertina, who wrote this really excellent article in Jigsaw, where he covers a lot of this. And he just notes how widespread Christianity had become among Arabic speakers. Now, keep in mind, Arabic speakers in the 6th and 7th century Middle East, they're not only in the Hejaz, but we know that folks in Syria, Arabic speakers, were mixing with Aramaic and Greek speakers as well. Even to the east of the Euphrates rivers, we know there are Arabic speakers there. So the so-called Lakhmeds, we're on both sides of the Euphrates. There's Hira, which might be the capital. Definitely the Sinai Peninsula had Arabic speakers. On the 6th century, Jacob of Surug, it writes from Syria in Syriac to a community in southern Arabia. We have now found inscriptions in Syriac in southern Arabia. Christian Robin has recently published on those as well. So we have a really robust bilingualism. And where there was Syriac, remember Syriac is Aramaic. It's just Christian Aramaic, basically, with its own script. So where there is bilingualism between Syriac and Arabic, there are Christians, because Syriac was basically an exclusive Christian language. So, for example, the Japhnids, sometimes called the Ghassanids, were Arabic speakers and Christians. They were Miaphysite Christians. Bertina points all of this out, but they were also bilingual. So they were Arabic speakers, but when they wrote principally in Syriac. So there's more of this. There's this interesting point about maybe there was an extra wave of Arabic speakers, Christians, who left from Palestine, Syria, towards the Hejaz because of the Persian occupation of Jerusalem in 614. Really quickly, I mean, we know actually not just from documentary reports, but also from inscriptions that bilingualism in the Arabic-speaking regions was pretty common. So this is very early. It's a 3rd century inscription studied by Ahmad al-Jalad. But here you find everything in bold is Aramaic or Syriac. Month is not shahr, it's yariha. Son is bar instead of ibn. Lord is mar instead of rab, etc., etc. But then the rest of it is Arabic. Okay, I want to pause a second so you can look at that slide. Here's another inscription, which is from the 6th century. We can see, this is studied by Leila Name. We can see that the Arabic script, as it is in the Quran, is basically already developed. You could see words like dhikr, you can see el-ilah very clearly here, and then you can see a Christian cross. So this comes from Duma, Ajau, so the really northern part of the what is today Saudi Arabia, in the southern part of the Nabatean realm. So very exciting to see these sorts of inscriptions. Of course, this is not in Mecca. I won't go any further into this is the actual inscription itself. So is up here. So you see the cross right there, El Ilah, right there. Some great camels as well. Yeah, I'm not going to go too far into this in my book in chapter 3. I speak about it a bit. I do want to mention briefly that this actually matches what we see in different passages in the Quran, which actually speak of, in a positive way, uh, monasteries, probably not cloisters, monasteries for sawama, and churches, bia, et cetera, along with masajid, mosques. Okay, so all right, I think I can do 5 minutes for each animal, and then hopefully be done in my Indiana time at 1:04 around there. Okay, first of all, very quickly, I just want to give a shout out to this really interesting work of art by an American artist named Sandow Birk, who in the years following 9/11 wanted to do a project in which he made Islam American. And so he illuminated a handwritten translation of the Quran with scenes from American life. So this is like Appalachian coal mine, like think of West Virginia or the western part of Virginia. So here you see the sleepers as American mine workers. And look, they've even got a dog there. So that's the intro to my bit about the dog. Okay, lots and lots could be said about the story of the cave. It's in Quran 18. I'm going to step back though and speak first about the origin of the story of the cave, which is pre-Islamic. And the origin has to do with debates among Eastern Christians over the resurrection of the body. So there were debates, and you can read through. This is from Sidney Griffith, by the way, in the book The Qur'an in its historical context. As Professor Griffith notes, there were debates in the 5th century, especially, but they carried on in the 6th century, where certain Christian theologians basically said only the soul is immortal. So the soul will be rewarded or punished without the body, or maybe God will provide a spiritual body for the soul, but the fleshly body will not be raised. I mean, this is considered generally to be heretical because the creeds of the 4th century already affirm the resurrection of the body. But this view popped up again. And so the story was written about young men who slept between the reign of the Emperor Decius, which is in the 3rd century, until the reign of the Emperor Theodosius II, which was in the 5th century. So they sleep about 200 years. And the most famous version of this is in Syriac. It's by the same guy I mentioned before, Jacob of Sarug. And he does not speak of a dog with the sleepers in the cave. Instead, he speaks of a watcher. Just quickly to mention about Jacob of Sarug, he writes in a metrical style. So his homilies are poetic, and they have sort of the same vibe of the Quran. He's not making the claims, of course, the Quran makes about the divine origin of the words, but it is a text that's highly concerned about style and meant for public recitation. Now, he has a reference to a watcher which God placed to care for the young men who are sleeping in the cave. And the young men are compared to sheep. So it's not hard to see where the dog, which appears in Quran 18:18, would come from if we have this allegory in which the young men are represented as sheep, being protected from the wolf, who was the bad Emperor Decius, and there's a watcher. If someone sought to decode that allegory, if you have a sheep and a wolf and then a watcher, what would a watcher be protecting sheep? It would be a dog. So we find it in the Qur'an, Qur'an 18. We actually know that before the Qur'an, it was already interpreted as a dog. It was understood that there was a dog in the cave because of the account of a pilgrim who went to Ephesus uh, sometime in the 6th century named Theodosius, who speaks of a dog. One last point, and then we'll be on to the bird. Just to note that the amazing thing about the story of the cave is that the Quranic author first tells the story and then has God give advice to the contemporaries of the prophet, telling them how to deal with controversies about the cave story. So, one of the two controversies is how many young men were in the cave. Was it three? Was it five? Was it seven? And then the Quranic author has God tell the audience, do not consult any of them about them. So who's the first them? Who's the second them? The first them, I argue, are Christians, because the story has a Christian origin. And the Quranic author is telling its audience, listen, when it comes to sorting out how many people were in the cave, do not ask the Christians about them. That is, the people of the cave, Ashab al-Kahf. Okay, that's an important insight for me because it says something about the context in which the Quranic author is working. Okay, we can skip then. This is really something about bilingualism. It's probably out of place, this slide. But this is from Surat al-Nahl, where there's a reference to someone who speaks an Ajami language, a barbarous language, which may be Aramaic. Okay, so on to the bird. And I'll try to do this in 5 minutes, Esteban. I know I'm moving kind of quickly here, but I want to make sure we can have some back and forth. So, yeah, the first point about Jesus and the bird in the Quran is to note how different the Jesus of the Quran is from the Jesus of the Gospels. Of course, one could point out the name. In Christian Arabic, he's Yesur. And in the Quran, of course, Jesus is Isa. But also, there is almost a 0% correspondence of things Jesus says in the Quran and things Jesus says in the Gospel. So, all of the Beatitudes, bread of life discourse, talks with folks on the road in Samaria or Galilee or Jericho or Jerusalem, like everything Jesus says in the Gospels, of all of that, none of it is in the Quran. And none of what Jesus says in the Quran is found in the Gospels. So, for example, I'm not really speaking about this verse, but you have these discourses in the Quran. Here, God and Jesus have this conversation. That's not found in the Gospels. Famously, in Surah As-Saf, we have a quotation of Jesus speaking to the Israelites, predicting a new messenger. That's not found in the Gospels, although there may be a connection to the Paraclete and the Gospel of John. But none of these words or turns of phrase are found in the Gospel. So we really have something new. And I know this maybe sounds like a simple or simplistic point, but it's worth emphasizing that this is something new that appears in the 7th century. These statements attributed to Jesus. Obviously, theologically, Muslims would say it's not actually from the 7th century, it's from the heavenly book. So, and it's a defensible theological view. But in terms of history, this is something new. We do not find this before the 7th century. And now we have direct speech, new quotations of Jesus, and none of what is found in the Gospels. You can maybe try to find something, a word or two, but basically none of what we find in the Gospels is given to Jesus as direct speech in the Quran. Okay, so on to the bird miracle. It's very well known, but just quickly to sum up, the bird miracle is mentioned in 2 places in the Quran. Jesus says, another statement of Jesus, I will make a bird out of clay, and I breathe into it, and it becomes a bird. And then Jesus adds, by Allah's leave or by God's permission. Okay, so I just have a very simple point about this, really, and I can wrap up pretty quickly. Now, the standard way of interpreting this phrase, by Allah's leave or by the permission of God, is to say, well, the Quran has a pure monotheism. that does not accept the claims of Christians that Jesus is God. And completely coherent reading of these passages. I'm not saying it's an incoherent reading. And just to give an example of this reading, it's just from alislam.org, I think is maybe, at least in English, the principal, one of the most popular Shiite Islamic websites. So, here we have this statement. It's just not really distinctly Shiite, but there is something from Jafar as-Sadiq lower. But anyway, so here this scholar says, many modern Christian scholars are very skeptical about miracles relating to Jesus. The Jews see him as no more than a magician. But the Holy Qur'an sort of takes a middle path between these two groups and conservative Christians by saying the Qur'an acknowledges the miracles of Jesus, but it emphasizes by the permission of God. In short, everyone other than Muslims have gone astray. Traditional Christians believe in the miracles, etc., etc. And then you have an interesting tradition from Jafar as-Sadiq that has to do with the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. Okay, so coherent reading of these passages. So I don't mean to dispute that that is indeed what the Qur'an is arguing, but I mean to ask, why does the Qur'an do this? Why does the Qur'an report this miracle of Jesus and then add, by God's permission? What was the goal or the objective of the Qur'an's author in doing this? Well, the first thing to say is that this miracle, which appears in earlier Christian sources, is meant by Christians indeed to be precisely what the Quranic author assumes it is, namely an argument for Jesus' divinity. The miracle clearly presents a parallel between God in Genesis, creating Adam from dirt, breathing into Adam and bringing him to life. And then Jesus in this tradition, for example, in the infancy gospel of Thomas, creates these birds from dirt or mud or clay, and he breathes into them and he brings them to life. In the Qur'an, in the infancy gospel of Jesus, he simply shouts to them and tells them, it's almost like he says, kun, and they come to life. So clearly a Christian reader in, for example, the infancy gospel of Thomas would see this as, oh, Jesus has the divine power to bring inorganic things to life. He therefore really is God incarnate. This is the whole agenda of this apocryphal gospel. And you can sort of read in the first verse here, he's basically speaking about the Lord Jesus Christ. There's also something about the Sabbath there as well. Okay, so it's really the conclusion here. I'm basically done. But so why did the infancy gospel author tell the story of the bird? To argue for Jesus' divinity. Why did the Quranic author raise this story up, remind us of it, and then say, by God's permission? To me, that is a really important detail that helps us understand the context in which the Quranic author was working. There was competition for Christians. Christians in his time and place were arguing for the divinity of Christ by telling stories such as Jesus and the birds. And the Quranic author couldn't just ignore it because these were very popular stories. And so he cites, it's almost though his hand were forced. He cites these stories and then flips the meaning of them by adding, by God's permission, bi-iznillah. By the way, just quickly, it's interesting to note that although most folks think the infancy gospel was pretty early, maybe 2nd century, the earliest manuscript sources are not in Greek, even if it was originally written in Greek. They are in Syriac, like the stories of the companions of the cave, and they come from the 6th century. So in terms of language and context, something very similar to what we think about when it comes to the Qur'an and its biblical subtext. Okay, yeah, just 2 quick conclusions. You can kind of read through them there. To me, the upshot of these two miracle stories is that Christian communities, not just one or two Christians, were a important part of the Qur'an's historical context, and that this sort of engagement should be seen within the context of religious competition. There was an open religious marketplace. I argue at the time of Islam's emergence, the Quranic author making these new claims about a new prophet had to make space for himself. This is my elementary school in West Hartford, Connecticut that I visited last year. And that's it. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, Gabriel. It's always a sign of a good lecture, and very often the case of Majlis is that I'm much less tired after than I was before. It's electrifying. You mentioned the marketplace, and this came to my mind immediately that Ibn al-Muqaffa actually writes about religious debates as a marketplace. So even the image of marketplace was there, used in the 8th century. So now I have two questions before closing the recording and open the floor. One is, I should have said at the beginning, one thing I learned from you, and I teach it since, is a very simple phrase, something like the Quranic. We have to see the Quranic text as homilies, so that basically people knew, like sermons, supposing the knowledge of the stories, and that really the Quran itself it gives evidence of the how much Hijaz and Arabia was saturated by monotheism. That's whether I still understand well your idea on this. That's one question. And the other is, what do you think of do you reject the pagan reservation altogether, in the sense that no pagans were there at all, or you reject the idea that it was all pagan? I would assume the second, but yeah.
Thank you. I know it's actually the first.
Okay.
I think paganism, in terms of institutional, that's the right term, it's probably a better adjective, but in terms of a socially organized community, paganism had disappeared and was not present at all in the Hijaz. So my claim is a little more radical. However, vestiges of paganism don't disappear that quickly, as we know from other cultural contexts as well. And to say that a region, like, what does it mean to say that Indiana is Christian, right? So my state, and what does it mean to say Indiana is Christian, like 90% Christian or whatever? If you actually went and started speaking to someone at the supermarket here in Indiana and asked him theology, who was Jesus, whatever, what is the Eucharist, what is Trinity, you're going to get a million different answers. So I think that's a caveat. For the first question, right, thank you for reminding me of this point of homilies. You're always so gracious, Istvan. I think it's very important as we discuss, and this is something I've come to appreciate more recently, and I think I neglected in some earlier writings, and I wish I could go back and correct it. But to me, increasingly, I see how important it is to be attentive to the style of the Qur'an. Too often, I engage with content in the Qur'an without thinking about the style. So it's very important to remember that the Qur'an clearly is a book meant to be recited. This is like Islam 101, right? But it's a book with 114 units, each of which is essentially independent, most of which clearly has a sort of ritually appropriate opening and beginning. ذَلِكَ ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه. Something like that. Some sort of ritually appropriate opening. And of course, the text rhyme. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق. So the author is concerned with producing a text that is scripture, that sounds like scripture, that is poetic, even if he wouldn't call it poetry, he wouldn't call it shi'r, but that is poetic. There is something analogous to the Syriac tradition of homilies. Homilies is a deceptive word, though, because we might think of a long, rambling homily at some local church in the UK or here. But in the Syriac tradition, it's a very formalized genre, meant probably not only to be proclaimed once by the priest, but then on ritual settings to be recited even by monastic community.
When you when you say scripture, you mean, what do you mean?
In terms of the Qur'an's
No, when you meant that the text is by the rhyme, that it means
Yes.
to be scripture.
Yes.
What sense of the word? I just want to grasp your idea completely.
Thank you. So something like the Book of the Psalms. So in the Eastern Church at the time, the Psalms were the book that Christians would pray with, also Jews, of course, and they were poetic, and they were understood to be words which God gave to us, with which we could praise God. And I see the Qur'an being a similar sort of project, which is meant to be a scripture which a believing community would receive from God and praise God with it.
Thank you. Now I'm going to do something which I will immediately regret, which is to conclude the recording. So I will conclude it, and then everyone can have their questions. Please raise your digital hand as Yasmin and Ali has already done, or just wave to me. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.